Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 147th MedAI Group Exchange session. Today, we have with us Dr. Dom Pimenta, who is the CEO and co-founder of TORTUS AI, a Khosla Ventures backed startup based in London. An internal medicine physician and cardiologist by training, he is recognized as NH's first AI attending. Dr. Pimenta is an active AI healthcare academic with a focus on integrating large language models and ambient voice technology into clinical workflows to improve efficiency and safety. Tortoise AI recently completed the largest clinical trial of ambient voice technology in Europe. And his talk today will present a framework to assess clinical safety and hallucination rates of LLMs for medical text summarization. Thank you so much, Dr. Pimenta, for representing this work with us. And before we go into your talk, uh, I wanted to ask you how you would like to take questions. Do you want to take questions while you're presenting, or do you want to reserve the questions for the end of the talk?
Why don't we just do it while it's a long talk, so it'd be boring if I just talk continuously anyway.
Yeah, awesome. So without much further ado, we I hand it over to Dr. Pimenta for the talk. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, and thanks so much for inviting me along. So today we'll be talking about our work to define the problem of using LLMs in healthcare, specifically for the task of medical text summarization in the of ambient voice technology. So taking speech to text and transforming that into the medical note. You'll all be familiar by now with companies like Abridge and Ambient, and we do a very similar thing here in the UK. I'll start with a story just to give a bit more background about what Tortoise is and what Tortoise does and why we care about this problem, and then why we embarked on academic research as a startup, which is obviously a rather unusual path. I've been a clinician for 16 years. This is actually a email I wrote to Cerner about 8 years ago. And I said, I've used PowerChart for a couple of years, but compared to traditional paper notes, it has several drawbacks, namely the practical workflow of a ward round is heavily impeded. I was being very polite, but the problem we're trying to solve, just to give some focus to this academic research, is that actually the interface between the clinician and the computer is very, very high friction. This slows clinicians down and it increases and contributes to clinician burnout. So what Tortoise is an AI interface that sits over that EHR. We combine lots of different AI technologies. Speech-to-text AI and large language models is what we'll talk about today. But the purpose is to free the clinician from the EHR while at the same time maintaining the quality and the clinical safety of those systems to the level that we would require in an enterprise healthcare setting. So the paper that we published a few months ago now in Nature Medicine is a framework to assess clinical safety and hallucination rates of large language models for medical text summarization. Practically, what this is a framework to measure and to reduce large language model hallucinations and emissions in clinical notes. It is not specifically a measure of tortoise, or to be honest, of any specific model. It is a way of thinking about the problem, classifying the problem both from a academic taxonomy, but also a clinical safety taxonomy, and introduction of various techniques to generate human data at scale in a controlled way using a custom GUI. We'll also talk a little bit about what we've now done with this. This is research that goes back about 2 years. And again, to circle back, how that influences the problem that we're trying to solve with the clinician on the ward. So this paper introduces four new novel elements. The first is an error taxonomy for clinical notes, very specific for what hallucination is in the context of ambient voice technology and an emission is in that same context. Then we further break that down into categories of risk, major and minor, and further break it down again into a taxonomy of subtypes of error, fabrication, negation, causality, and contextuality. We introduce the concept of iterative experimental design and demonstrate that you can, with instruction fine-tuning alone, significantly reduce errors in large language models, but you can't reduce it to zero, and that's an interesting discussion that maybe we'll have time for at the end. And then we talk about clinical safety assessment. The UK NHS is actually one of the highest bars of healthcare IT safety systems in the world. And as a consequence, we've adapted some of them to specifically look at this specific task and give a shared taxonomy for how I, as a clinician here, can look at an AI technology and say this is a significant risk of harm and have agreement with a clinician in the Mayo Clinic or Stanford. And then we'll briefly talk about Creola, the concept of creating a clinician-in-the-loop platform and how important that is for validating enterprise AI systems at scale, as well as data generation for research purposes. So let's start with the ERA taxonomy for clinical notes. Now, I think it's not going to be a new concept to this audience that large language models hallucinate. But when we first started, going back to 3 years ago, we didn't really have a way of measuring that at all. That was quantifiable or iterable or in fact transferable between different versions of the product. So we were evaluating large language models to use in production for our specific task. But we quite quickly realized that without these tools, we wouldn't have a meaningful way to change the model, to say it was getting better, or to iterate with customers. So we had to go away and really think about what is the task that we're actually trying to achieve. And this is a real bedrock of how clinical evaluation of large language model systems should be done across the board. It starts with the problem and it starts with an acute taxonomy that's specific to your problem, and then you work backwards from there. So if you look at what ambient voice technology actually is, we use a speech to text AI model to get a transcript. We can measure error in that transcript in a very traditional way, word error rate. That's a very established technology. Then we take that transcript and we turn it into a medical note. Now, if you think about what the human task is, so I, as a clinician, am sitting in clinic. I'm listening to a patient talk about their day and their house, but also their heart failure symptoms and swelling in their legs and the fact that they can't lie down at night and a pink frothy cough. There are relevant facts in that conversation. There are irrelevant facts in that conversation. And when I document them, I need to ensure that what I'm documenting is accurate, as in it's entailed to that conversation. So if we think about it as a concept of fact transference from the conversation, or in fact now any input, which could be from the medical record, it could be the physician's own notes, into that medical note. If a fact is present in the transcript and also present in the note, we can consider it a true positive. If a fact is absent in that transcript input and fact is absent in the note, that's a true negative. And that's an infinite space, so we can ignore that. And things that don't talked about and weren't written down is everything. Now, when we talk about facts that are present in the note but are not in the conversation, these are false positives. And this is hallucinations for this definition of this specific use case. And similarly, if a fact is present in the transcript but it's not in the note, this is a false negative and we would consider admission. Now, again, there's nuance around the clinical setting. And a fact that's entirely fabricated or made up is extremely dangerous in the concept of healthcare, especially in the concept of a medical note. A fact that was discussed in a conversation but is not in the medical note actually is a sort of order of magnitude less important. And the reason for that is it's subjective. If the patient talks about the flavor of crisps, sorry, what would you call them in the US? The flavor of chips that they enjoy, that is extremely relevant if you are a dietitian and you are trying to build a dietary plan for that patient. It is extremely irrelevant if you're an orthopedic surgeon and you're going to replace that patient's knee. Therefore, omissions are actually quite hard to A, measure, and B, to actually action on. So most of our research now centers around hallucinations and reduction of those hallucinations and entailment, and increasingly the provenance of data in the record with AI generated notes being the norm now, at least in large parts of the US, that becomes more and more important. And then we can look at those error types and we can classify them again from a simple perspective and then from a more complicated one, into terms of clinical impact. So the first thing to think about in terms of clinical impact is how do we think this would impact either the diagnosis, the treatment, or the management of the patient if it was left uncorrected in that note. So a major error would be one that, if we left it uncorrected, would impact significantly on the patient's downstream onward journey, like a new diagnosis or a new treatment or a change to the management plan. A minor error would not have such impact. And that's how we looked at the system in this particular paper. We can also then look at the types of errors, specifically around hallucination types. So fabrication, that's the most new clinical information completely de novo. But there are other much subtler types that are actually much harder to track and also to track potentially the impact on the clinician because increasingly in a world where we worry about reliance bias, as in these systems are now being used very regularly in a vast majority of consultations in many healthcare systems in the US and increasingly so here in the UK after the 1,000th output, how sensitive is the clinician to potential errors in that text, and therefore how much does the potential error have or chance of downstream impact on that patient? So negation errors are actually very subtle. They are negating clinical facts that were present in the transcript. For example, the patient has no allergies, documents allergies, or vice versa. Very significant, but actually very hard to detect. Causality is also a very common habit that LLMs have when writing about a clinical. They tend to infer potential causation, potential derivations of symptoms of specific other diseases. And again, if the clinician hasn't thought about that or has in fact been swayed by what the large language model thought, again, that's an unintended consequence that we don't fully understand and we would want to admit from the system. And the last is contextual. Often when patients talk about different contexts, the model will mix topics that are otherwise not related. So the experiment that we detailed in this paper was essentially a pipeline. And again, anyone here can go on the GitHub, take the code. It's the PriMock dataset. It's 25 mock consultations. We ran the experiment 18 times and we generated 450 note pairs, which broke down into just under 13,000 sentences in the medical notes and just under 50,000 sentences in the transcript. Take this data set, generate the outputs. We then had about 50 clinicians signed up, trained, and validated, running it in two cohorts. First person takes a look, labels hallucination emissions. Second person does that independently. And the third person, which was either myself or one of my fellow authors, Dr. Ascari, would then consolidate the results. And where there was disagreement, we would actively decide. We'd analyze those results and then decide if that is clinically safe. And if not, we could evaluate the shortcoming. And this was actually how initially, going back nearly 2 years, we actually iterated the product. So this was a deployed product. It was live with a number of clinicians, and we were using this pipeline, as you can imagine, very slowly, but still effectively, to analyze errors in the system and to make significant changes or errors to the system. So there's some questions in the chat here potentially. How did you de-identify the notes prior to sending it to the LLM? So for the purposes of this, so there's two stages to the question. In production, we use multiple systems, zero data retention, and also various data redaction systems. But actually for this specific use case, this is a mock data set. It's all simulated data. It's not real, so there is no PHI data, so we didn't have to de-identify it. Was there another question? Oh no, just people sent the Firefly. Okay, no problem. So great. So these are the results that we saw. So just to orientate you, here we have the number of sentences overall, and the green is hallucination, and the gray is non-hallucinated sentences, with various different prompts at the bottom. So 18 different experiments, all different prompts, but the same model settings and the hyperparameters here are there if anyone would like to replicate. You can see there's actually quite wide variation in the hallucination rates. Overall, we saw about a 1.47% hallucination rate, which was derived from the number of hallucinations over the number of note sentences total. So another way to put that is, here's all the clinical facts. Which of these clinical facts were hallucinated? Did not see, with maybe the exception of this experiment, any experiment that didn't have any hallucinations at all. And there was a variation in the number that we would see as a percentage in each output. And then if we look at the sorry, go on.
Dom, uh, the in the previous slide you were showing it's the error analysis and then it goes into the change the system box, change to pipeline. So what kind of change are you doing? It's the prompt update?
Yeah, so for this particular experiment, the question was like, is this a property of the models, or actually can you instruction fine-tune? And actually, there's some much later research out now that suggests that you are actually making meaningful changes to the parameters within the model by changing the prompt itself. It changes some of the attention weights. But anyway, the point here was like, is this actually feasible and is this actually was possible? And then the way that we were then iterating obviously it took 2 or 3 weeks between each experiment. So this was more or less 6 months of work, was to say, well, what is it that we thought the cause of each of these sort of prompts error types were. And that's where this classification became super useful. Is it just a fabrication? Is it a negation? Is it contextual or is it causal? And you can see that actually the majority of hallucinations in this context do in fact impact patient care or could if they were uncorrected. And that was actually quite surprising. It wasn't the minority at all. It was most of them. And the other interesting finding was hallucinations per section. So a typical note for this particular study was divided into sections. So history is what the patient said. Symptoms is obviously how they described their presenting complaint. Examination findings, the sort of assessment as in the diagnostic assessment, the discussion, and then the plan. And you'll see that the majority of hallucinations for large language models was around assessments and plans. And this is probably because of the innate requirement of LLMs to complete their outputs. And incomplete output isn't what they're trained for or rewarded for. So the tendency to add additional information towards the end of the note when actually in some, there may not be an assessment or there may not be a plan was a very persistent finding. And again, this is also where clinical errors, hallucinations have the highest impact, whereas actually in the history section, they have the lowest impact overall.
Sorry, can I ask you one quick thing?
Yeah, sure.
So, are you looking for a particular patient population or is like any generic patient population? Because I believe that the plan also depends on what patient population you are looking for. And like if it is a plan for flu treatment versus plan for COVID treatment, plan versus plan for like some cancer treatment, I think they also have a lot of effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, as an untested hypothesis, this is primary care in the UK.
Okay,
So,
got it.
yeah, so very generic, very
And very
relatively,
wide too, right? Because,
yeah, I mean, pretty wide, but to be honest, it's
right.
all like MSK or headache problems, or, I mean, there wasn't very much derivation. I think one of the weaknesses of this study is that the base data isn't specifically very diverse.
Got it, got it. Because I was imagining like since you show that much big variation in the plan, but for example, if you go for an oncology care or as you mentioned, like MSK care, probably we don't see that big variation in the plan.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I actually would be surprised if you're looking at hallucination rates in any
Hmm.
setting
Hmm.
and the plan and the assessment is actually not always where LLMs like to hallucinate. I mean, again, spent me too much time using them and not anthropomorphizing here, but it does seem to be an innate tendency of the model behavior that is a very specific place where it wants to complete.
But
And
I believe like that there actually the hallucination rate is kind of difficult to calculate also, right? Because for example, that if the model generate a plan which is concurrent with the guideline from the
yeah,
oncology treatment, do you consider it as a hallucination or you consider it is correct?
exactly. So that is a really good point. So like there's two ways of using large language models. One is to say, have at it, do your best, and then let's see what the clinician thinks, right? But that unconstrained use, in our view, is hyper dangerous. It's hyper dangerous for the fact that you can rely on it, you could de-skill, you have no control over what it's saying and why. And also often, obviously, because we know that's where you can really run very quickly into fabrication problems. The lawyer who was struck off, for example, for using it to generate his briefs. That was because it was fabricating references in a professional setting. So we would consider that to be a hallucination. Even if it's
Got it.
appropriate, it's
Mm.
not entailed. And that's the critical piece. This is a transformation of text problem. It is not about generating medical advice or diagnostics. That's a whole different company. And we decided to constrain that. And over here, actually, we are now a class one medical device. We're on our way to be a class two. We have to be so careful about what the system does and does not do for that reason. I have to show the MHRA over here, which is our FDA equivalent, the performance of the system for accuracy. I don't have to show them the performance of the system for diagnostic capability because
Right,
that's
got it.
use. That makes sense.
Right, got it.
De-identifying. Yeah, we just covered that. Okay, so where am I? Yes, and then yeah, and then emissions. Emissions, again, I'm not actually so bothered about emissions. I think it's a subjective problem, and I don't necessarily think it's that important overall. So I'm just gonna skip it. Um, So then what we did is we took the clinical safety systems that we have already in place for traditional health IT, and then we looked at the ones that we said would have an impact, and then we tried to work out the severity of harm of that impact. So again, this is a pretty standard methodology. I'm a clinical safety officer here in the UK. I'm one of three in our company. And this is something that we use all the time anyway for different features, not just the large language model feature, but for any feature of the software. So we look at two factors and then we create an index, probability of harm. For this specific experiment, we actually quantified it. So we said 90% was very high probability, less than 2% was very low, and there was a spectrum between. And then we based that on the recorded findings of the hallucination rate in that particular experiment. The consequence of harm is derived from this table. Again, this is actually reproduced from some NHS guidelines. It ranges from catastrophic, where multiple patients could potentially die, which is probably quite unlikely if you think about we're doing a one-to-one scenario here, but you never know. Major with single deaths or permanent life-changing capacity, all the way down to minor, which is minor injury and minor psychological upset. This is also replicated in pharma actually for adverse events, so it's a pretty common system around the world. And then you just take that and you index it and you generate this risk graph. Generally, for healthcare technologies in any setting, you're only really permitted to have a residual risk of a 2, which is like this area here. So, you could have something that's relatively high likelihood of happening, but only has very minor consequence, or very low likelihood of happening and only major consequence. But basically, catastrophic risk is not really allowed, as you can imagine. And even a very high and something quite minor is also not permissible. And what we have to do is we have to map these risks, think about them, mitigate them, reanalyze them. Some of it's actually relatively subjective, and that's why systems like this, which incorporate clinical judgment, are so critical because otherwise you can't actually incorporate the judgment of a clinician into the system design, can't quantify it, but it's sort of a work in progress how we do that. So if we look back then using that matrix at the hallucinations that we detected, well, where did the majority fall? So as I said, we didn't see any in that highest risk of harm category 5 for obvious reasons. It's mostly around catastrophe to multiple patients, not possible when you're just generating the note for a single patient, which wouldn't affect any other patient's nodes. But 54% had a risk of significant harm or greater. And actually, in the parlance of software, all of this above this is unacceptable level of risk. This is probably unacceptable as well. We'd want to mitigate it. We again had a look at the severity based on the type of hallucination. So fabrication types were probably the commonest and also the commonest risk, more or less. But negations were the ones where it had the most danger. And that's because they're the subtlest. Generally, if you have, say, no leg edema and your note says you have leg edema, or you have an allergy and your note says no allergies, the binary state of that, if that was left uncorrected and that went downstream, could definitely change your diagnosis and treatment. But if an allergy status, for example, could be catastrophic. So there's a lot to be said for A, how do we cope for this? And B, actually, how do we start cross-referencing AI-generated notes and letters against the context of the medical record, for example, and flagging discordance? The same thing with causality, although to be honest, the risks around that, unless it was ascribing the risk to for example, breathlessness ascribed to a PE, may negate the fact that you need to investigate for heart failure or pneumonia and that doesn't get treated. So that could be a major risk. But overall, I think the biggest worry is that it are always going to be the subtlest errors in the outputs. And again, we saw the biggest risks in the plan. If you want to look at hallucinations causing significant harm, LLMs generating treatment plans completely unaided is a super bad idea. And that's where you see a lot of majority and potential severe catastrophe error. The same thing with diagnosis. A fabricated diagnosis in the context of a patient could massively change what they do, especially if, for example, the treatment for pneumonia is to give them fluids, lactate, oxygen culture, and catheter and antibiotics. The treatment for heart failure is to give them diuresis and basically leave them alone. If you mix those two up, you're going to kill either patient in either scenario. So diagnosis can be very, very significant.
sorry, another quick question. So here the risk you are measuring in terms of the causal effect. Here risk is not the false omission or the false generation, right?
Yeah, so this is whether or not these types of hallucinations, if you go back to this chart here, where they fell into their likelihood, but also their severity of impact potentially on the patient, if they weren't corrected in the note, is the
So
statement.
that means like here the causality you are if you are analyzing based on what would be the possible action based on the current text, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
Got it.
if this was uncorrected, what might happen? And then that's how we sort of analyze that. Because obviously these patients don't actually exist, so this isn't what
Right.
actually happened. This is just, but that's all you know, the whole concept of hazard management in healthcare, we use a sort of what if type scenario, and then we create a bunch of risks and then we mitigate them. And we did the same thing here, but with real patients. So this patient has breathlessness, this specific emission in that context, what could that potentially mean? And that's how we came up with this um, taxonomy.
But can't you analyze their actual outcome versus if the text is wrong, what would be their possible outcome and just measure the difference?
Yeah, you could if they were real patients, but they're not.
Right.
There is
Right.
no
Okay.
downstream. But you're right, and I think that's what's a really interesting part. So once, increasingly now AI is plugged in to the EHR. So actually that is
Yeah,
something that we
exactly.
really want to do. This continuous monitoring and updating of your own decision making based on what actually happened. So, for example, to give a free idea out to the group, if you were to plug an LLM in over time to make diagnoses, but it didn't do anything, it didn't even show its diagnosis until it had spent 2 or 3 or 4 years checking if actually its large language model weights would automatically self fine-tuning on the actual clinical outcomes of what happened with the patient. So that you could actually do in a continuous manner, validated for that patient population. And only when you're outperforming all clinicians would you even start showing that data to the clinician to actually influence intervention. And then you'd also have to then make sure that that actually did make a difference and you could do some sort of A/B testing. But that's a little bit beyond where most research lies. Also, lots of outcomes will take years, sometimes if ever, to actually be visible in the record. A funny
I
thing
think
that,
that's why when you mention the primary care, I think this is an interesting field because primary care actually you can track the outcome with pretty reasonable timeline, right?
yeah,
Because, for example, if you are looking, yeah, cancer patient, probably then the tracking becomes really difficult. But if it's a primary care patient, they don't change. I don't know what is the situation in UK, but in US, for example, they don't change their primary care provider very often. So if needed, you can actually track their outcome pretty
yeah.
strongly, you know?
I was actually going to say the same thing. So, like, something that we've learned from the US system is it's actually the way that information travels around with you guys is actually quite poor. It's very
Right.
fragmented.
Hmm.
Over here in the UK, your primary care physician is also the de facto holder of all your medical information. So
Ah,
every
okay.
should feedback by the fact that they don't look after you since you leave. The concept of me as a cardiologist being on call, you can't see me directly. You can only come to the hospital through A&E or via the heart attack center or via your GP. There is no route direct to special in the UK. Therefore, everything in theory, in practice it isn't, but in theory should actually be in the primary care record. Therefore, that would be very possible here.
Right. Because that's why I think this clinical safety study that you are doing probably it would be like more interesting if we start thinking about a retrospective scenario
Yeah.
where you are actually tracking the outcome of the patient based on their primary care provider.
Yes. But then you'd have to very unethically change the prompts to generate errors and then track what
But it
happens.
can be synthetic, right? It can be like imagine like a parallel universe that the patient goes to their correct line, but you have
Yeah,
a parallel universe where you are
that's
thinking
I
if
like
it
what
go
you're thinking. That is super interesting. So there's a concept of digital twins, and in
right.
fact,
I know that. Yeah.
there's a company that's approved actually in Europe. I can't remember what they're called, but apparently, like they're approved for drug trials. So actually, for
Right.
this concept of like clinical error and then what happens,
But I don't like the digital twin because in the sense like I don't like means like of course I like, but the thing is like digital twin always does not really focus too much on the clinical notes, you know. They always
yeah.
focus on the other data element like imaging, genomics, multiomics, but never on the clinical note. But what you are thinking is more like thinking of a digital twin from the clinical note perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's a really good idea. And you could probably generate that quite well and then sort of introduce errors and then look at
Right.
harm. Hold that thought. I'll see you in a year. We'll do it.
Sure.
We'll get it done. Cool. Just double checking another question. Yeah, fine. So the risk of severity of major emissions, as you can see, actually less important. Again, quite categorically so different to the impact of hallucinations. And generally, I'd say emissions are extremely difficult. Sometimes when we make the notes more detailed, our clinicians complain, and then we change it back and they complain. And then we give them the feature to choose if they want it more comprehensive or more concise, and then they complain. So it's a very subjective field, and I think it's probably more important that we track specifically how we handle certain critical facts, like allergy status, for example, than it is for us to look across the board at every single element in the note. And this is just an example of iteration. So I think there's a lot to be said for prompt engineering, especially with some of the newer models in terms of there's frameworks now that you can do this far faster than we had to do it 2 years ago. Things like DSPY, for example. But here's a good so you've got exactly the same input data, and all that we've done between these two experiments is change the underlying prompt. I think just one prompt actually for both of them. And you can see you can have a very significant impact on both hallucination rate and emission rate, and you can continuously refine that. Um, the problem with doing it with humans is that your iteration speed, a little bit like imagine you had to do, there's lots of ML people here, gradient descent, but every calculation had to be done by hand by 150 clinicians that took you 2 weeks. Actually getting to that optima is going to be, a years long process, if not longer. And therefore, although this is interesting academically, it is not, I would recommend, a way to productionize systems at scale. Um, so we used this framework for iterative design, and I actually think it's quite a good example of how you can incorporate at scale lots of clinician judgment in a qualitative way. So we built a custom GUI, so graphical user interface. There are companies now that actually do just this. Maybe we missed the boat and we should have done just this as well, but there's a company called Autoblocks, there's Vellum, we've used a bunch of them. But it enables you to grab the hallucination sentences, to label them, and then also to do the reverse. Creola is the platform. It's actually an acronym. It stands for Clinical Research and Evaluation of LLMs and AI. It's named after Creola Catherine Johnson, who was one of the first human computers at NASA in the 60s. And by hand, you can see the analogy, she did the calculations that landed the Apollo moon landings on the moon. And we thought that was quite apt for how we were using human in the loop design in the system. So that's where the sort of system has taken us thus far. We've developed Creola now in flight from a human in the loop system to a live AI system. And that's a whole other branch of research, which is super secret. And I'm not going to talk about it other than that's what we actually did with this output. We called this Shelley, which is another acronym that we introduced to the world very recently. But what this enables us to do is to take that work in terms of the hand labeling of hallucinations and emissions and do it now not just in 2 weeks, but in just under 2 seconds. And I think that's what the iteration of once you have that human data and you validated the approach, then you can massively speed through it and use AI systems at scale to do that. And that is kind of the requirement for enterprise. We have to have AI systems watching AI systems because there really is no alternative. And this sort of science is evolving all of the time, and that's why it's relatively super interesting to work in this space right now. Yeah, so that's where I'm going to finish. And I say thank you everyone for listening. If you'd like to email me or ask me any questions now, for sure, but otherwise my email is dom@tortoise.ai. And yeah, I'll ask if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pimenta. Before we start, open the floor for any more questions, I would like to ask our audience to give our speaker a round of applause. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, like, we can go ahead and ask some questions.
I can probably start with one. You showed the very interesting presentation, first of all, and then you showed the risk categorization. In my experience with LLMs, how much the error kind of also sometimes depends on if whatever diagnosis or whatever clinical scenario you're looking at is rare or not. Because in some cases, I've seen much more hallucination if I'm looking for a certain rare scenario,
Oh,
and
is
I'm
it?
asking the LLM to look for a certain rare scenario in the note. Does the frequency of a certain diagnosis or a certain plan, does that affect that risk categorization from like catastrophic to um, major, minor, and then significant?
Yeah, that's a super good question. I don't actually know the answer to that. I think the difference for what we're trying to do here, though, is like the ground truth is because we've constrained the system to be that way, is the input data, right? So there is
Mhm.
no there's no ether that the knowledge needs to be pulled from. It's not fabricating based on its clinical judgment. It's looking at every single thing that it says has happened. Has that happened? So it's directly one-to-one entailed. So if the diagnosis is like super rare,
Mhm.
like African trypanosomiasis or some beautiful word like that,
Mhm.
then that should be said by the clinician and it will be entailed directly.
Okay.
But I think it is a failing of the study it per se is that we just don't have the broadness of data to even answer that question. It's a very small, based on the fundamental architectures as opposed to trying to look across the spread. The one thing I would say is audio quality. So we do have some other data that shows that the quality of the audio that you present to the model is sort of directly correlated, sort of R of zero point 0.6, with the hallucination rate. And again, it's a bit like cognitive decline and hearing loss. The two kind of accelerate that on a human level. It's very similar in this particular context. If the audio quality is poor, the LLM will also hallucinate, which also makes me think, how would it deal with rare diseases or things that are hard to hear or that it doesn't have the vocabulary for? So the end-to-end pipeline might also struggle with that scenario. But we don't have the data to support that.
And when you say poor quality of audio, I thought like you first convert it into the transcript and then that transcript is fed into the L. So presumably, if the audio quality is poor, then the transcript has more errors that are further fed into the LLM. Okay, okay, that
Correct.
makes
And
sense.
actually, what's interesting though is when you get a very poor transcript from an AI
Uh-huh.
model, it will have plausible sounding words, and that is a very high risk of generation of hallucinations because the interpretation is very different. If that makes sense.
Yep, yep. Thank you very much. I think we have a few questions in the chat as well.
Oh, sure.
Uh, is
Uh,
voice to text good with different accents?
yes. And it's a
Okay.
really interesting audience to tell you exactly why. So, voice to text historically is awful with accents, and that unfortunately includes English. I mean my English accent, not American English. And that's because, as you know, right, all historical models are phoneme based. So the models that underlie them, a much older form of algorithms, are matching each individual sound against a Gaussian distribution of sounds to generate that word. And if you go back to when I first started using VR about 25 years ago, you literally couldn't, you had to train it for days and it still really wouldn't work, especially not in British English, which was very frustrating. The models that we have now, they're all transformer based. So they are looking at the entire context of all of the audio, so 20 minutes of audio, not just that one discrete phoneme. And that means just like you or I, if I hear my wife shouting something, I'm in the supermarket, it probably means get the bread. But if I'm in the hospital and someone's shouting at me and I'm in a cardiac arrest, it probably means the patient's dead. So like there's two, you have an innate context that we have as humans and actually large language models, but also the transformer architecture that underlies most modern speech to text systems also has that. And as a sort of added benefit, then actually most way of coping with strong accents is very, very accurate. We've actually got some good data to support this. So what we did is we took the transcripts as the gold standard of truth, generated American English from them, and then we also synthetically generated a bunch of very strong accents. So we looked at Zosen, well, actually, we looked at figures. So we did Zosen, Gandhi, Mandela, Zelensky, Einstein, a couple of others. And then we reran the system to see what the error rates were relative to those different accents. Because obviously it's hard to separate accent and grammar. So we had
Mhm.
to sort of artificially do that. And actually, we didn't find any significant error rates at all, other than medication names. So if you look at the tortoise intended use, all clinicians using these systems should be doing closed loop communication where you repeat back the medication name specifically to the patient, and that massively helps the system. The other thing in this particular context is you also have two speakers. So actually a lot of it is closed loop anyway, because the doctor will ask further questions, the patient will say things, or vice versa. So actually it works very well.
That makes sense.
Um,
But overall, when you evaluate the error in the pipeline, do you have like some module to first correct this transcript so that there is no error at that level, or the error is at least is minimized before you feed it into the LLM? Or
yeah,
it's just the error is computed overall on the
it's it,
full pipeline, don't know where it is coming from?
yeah, no, I mean we have observability data across the entire pipeline. So for
Mm.
example, we have the confidence information from the speech to text model. So we can say and we can monitor this. We know the quality of audio because we get the confidence of every utterance that the
Okay.
model produces. And we know that crystal audio should have an average confidence of 0.99. About zero point 0.8, you can't really hear very much, and zero point 0.6 is basically the microphone's off or it's somewhere else. And actually, what we're now doing is surfacing that back to the clinician so they can correct or change their audio stream because I think actually that's really important that we constantly give that feedback. In the same way that, we're on a call and someone can't hear, they might say, "Oh, I can't hear you. Can you sort your sound out?" rather than letting you continue. Now, it's interesting what you said about correction. What would you use to use correction? You'd use the large language model. Most speech to text systems have some sort of transformer-based architecture anyway. And then obviously you're about to feed it to a large language model. So the correction basis is a bit difficult. We have tried things like injecting custom vocabulary into that space. But
Mhm.
again, you can actually induce hallucinations if you're too aggressive about doing that, and you can
Okay.
over-index on certain words. So there's a real subtlety to it in terms of how we think it transpires and how it works out. The modern LLMs are actually really good at context and transcripts as long as they get the vocabulary correct.
Okay.
There's a question here from Yiran. Do you also consider using this on medical imaging? Like there are some hallucinations also in images generated from generative models. How can we measure and fix that? That's quite an interesting question. I don't know any medical imaging currently that's being generated by AI models, but I think what you mean is like, can you entail a report per se if it's reading for like a VLM that's looking for specific features? It's not something I know a terrible amount. One of our previous engineers and actually one of the authors of this paper is now the CTO of a company called Mecha Health. That's exactly what they do. They do explainable reporting of radiology, and it's all a different type of AI architecture that underlines it. But you should check out that company because they're kind of answering that question, and in my opinion, answering it really well. Um, no more questions there. Any other questions from the room?
Hi, John, I have one question.
Hi.
Yeah, nice talk. And I just have one question is that, so currently training AI model on input samples usually requires a large amount of data. So is there any possibility to achieving good training result with only a small amount of data? And could you please give us some advice?
Yes, I'd say it depends on what you're trying to achieve. I think obviously, traditional ML, if you're trying to train a classification model, then probably the more data, as long as your values are scaling, the better. And you'll get your answer to whether or not your model is getting better if your scaling law it continues to climb. So the more data you add, the better performance, and then you know that you haven't plateaued. As soon as you start to see that plateau, you'll know that for that specific task, you're not going to be able to fix it
Mhm.
with increasing quantity. For this paper, we were actually looking much more at like architecture. So like, how do we do this? How do we understand this as a problem? How are we going to analyze it? And actually from that, we actually generated sufficient data to then back validate and build automated systems from the human labels. So it's just a question of like, it's not a lot of consultations, it's only 25. But then you run it 18 times, you've got 450 examples, and then you've got 50,000 sentences. And that's a hell of a lot of data for humans to annotate, but then actually it gives you a very good and very solid data set to do something meaningful with that, and you can then back validate with the human validators that your automated system actually does work. So I think for evaluation systems, you don't need that much data, especially if you want to repeat and make something very robust. But then you also want to be able to analyze it in the real world and look at edge cases. If you're building something from scratch, your answer is, well, how much data can you get? And are you still finding scaling? And then that'll give you some justification to continue to improve performance. And I'd say the other question is like, what does it matter? So like, I've seen a lot of people optimizing. I'll give you a really good example. I built a machine learning algorithm in my previous role that could tell you if a patient had fatty liver disease and they were running into a pharma trial. And it was amazing. It had, I think we had like 7,000 patients worth of data. The AUCs were like 0.99. It was just the best algorithm ever. And it was very good. And then we broke it down and we looked at the actual features that drove that algorithm. And it was the waist circumference and the patient's age. And that was it. And actually, you didn't need any of that technology. You didn't need a machine learning model at all. You can just use your eyes to know that as you get older or as your BMI increases, you're going to have fatty liver disease, and we just shouldn't put those patients in trials. And that's already in the protocol. There are age cutoffs and there are BMI cutoffs. So it's completely pointless. So I guess the question more fundamentally is like, how close to that problem does it get you to solve, and can you solve it?
Okay, got you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Anand's asked, what are cost savings using your product compared to doing it manually? Ballpark. That's an interesting question. I think in the UK, you can't do what we do manually because it's a regulated market. So in the same way that you can't hook up your own pacemaker, increasingly you can't hook up your own AI system and do healthcare tasks with it. And I think that's right. In the US, currently, it's unregulated, and you're seeing a big balloon and potentially now a big collapse as a consequence. And I think the FDA will probably change the moniker on that. So I think the question is like, who takes the risk? To build the systems, I think it's going to be way cheaper to do it yourself. If you're going to get sued, though, that's going to be very expensive. So I think in the US, it'll be very expensive. So if I do find it interesting as a UK physician that the highest medico-legal, most litigious environment I could imagine working in, which is the US healthcare system, also has one of the lowest bars to health tech and what it's used for, and it's relatively unregulated. And I just can't really resolve that. And I imagine, precedents in the court will eventually resolve it. Yeah, the US seems to be going that way. I think that will change. It'd be an interesting bet. And if you're ever in London, I'll buy you a beer if I'm wrong. Somebody will die from an AI generated note. In fact, I can tell you over here, there's already been a court case with an AI generated note. And I know that because that was our note that we generated. And actually it was great because it was part of the court and it's defended it, and it's very useful. But that's already becoming part of the system. It will definitely happen in the US. There will be a lawsuit. It will be regulated. It can't really not. I don't see a world where that happens. And similarly, the technology itself will just get better. It will do more for the clinician, decision support, care navigation. It can't really not, again, because it's such a natural progression of where we are. That will also need to be regulated, especially when we start letting AI talk directly to patients and make decisions. So it'll be interesting to see how, things transpire under this administration and maybe the next one, but I think that will change at some point.
One other thought, Dom. So prompt can make a lot of difference, and then in the same series we have had speakers who tell us that okay, LLM also makes a lot of difference. You can have the same size LLM from GPT to Mistral to something else, and that also changes, and then a new version comes in. So the work that you're presenting, you see it more of as a framework for evaluation, because I presume like whatever these observations are, if you start using ChatGPT 5 today, it's probably going to change, and if you start using some other LLM, that will change as well.
Yeah, exactly. So this is actually, I mean, this is 2 years old. Everything, the actual models are completely meaningless. I think this is GPT-4, so we're what, about 6 generations back now? The names don't make any sense, but you know what I mean. But I think it's quite critical, and we had to build this system for that exact reason. Every time a model comes, so if you look at model performance, right, it's a triplicate. It's the prompt, it's the model, and it's the underlying hardware that determines the output.
Mhm.
And actually, for most companies using closed models, you can only actually iterate on the prompt and to some extent the model, as in you can control those factors. You can't necessarily control hardware because of balancing issues and things like that. So unless you want to run it open source or do it yourself, which increasingly is now possible. But again, you have to be able to make trade-off choices for why you're going to use it over here, for latency, for cost, and for speed, but that doesn't compromise clinical quality. And without a system like this, you can't actually do that. But actually, more importantly, to go back to Danting's question, I think actually what we demonstrated here is that there is not enough data full stop anywhere. And the reason for that is in healthcare, it's already a sort of infinite space, like the human doctor, the patient, then is infinite in terms of the variables, in terms of how unusual that could be. And then you feed that to a probabilistic machine, the output is unpredictable and it will always be unpredictable. Therefore, you have to have live monitoring. Therefore, you have to have a system like this that you can do at least to intervene when there is a significant mistake. And then it also fundamentally asks the questions, are LLMs actually an appropriate architecture for healthcare? And the answer is probably not, actually. But if you can build the system, I'll leave you with one thought whenever we were asked about this question. Is like, I think about large language models as like your car engine. Don't sit on your car engine. It won't go anywhere and you'll get burnt. You need to build the car around it. And it's the constellation architecture, the guardrails, the inputs, the quality controls, the observability that builds an enterprise medical device vehicle versus something off the shelf that's probably going to cause a lot of harm. And I would say actually some of the off the shelf companies are actually just startups that aren't doing any of the safety stuff. And that's going to be a bigger problem very soon.
That, that's
And
excellent.
Dom, since you mentioned that point, I think another interesting thing since you mentioned these guardrails is that we are also thinking the LLM in a more common term, you know. So always we think that LLM is generative, but LLM also can be extractive, right? Like the extractive LLM, which actually extract the information. Those are also super important for clinicians that
Mm.
you use those extractive LLM to curate some data or gather some more like a patient temporal timeline and all these things. I think the guardrails, we are also thinking that the guardrails are more or less similar, but those guardrails are different than when you actually have a generative LLM, which is kind of you don't have a lot of control on those guardrails, you know. I
Yeah,
think I
exactly.
yeah, I also feel like the current companies, particularly working on LLM, they actually sometimes mix these two concepts,
Yes,
you know,
I think so too.
and that also create a kind of like a confusion. Like, did they really thought about it? Did they put those guardrails, you know? Because we are also as a from like because we are in the I am in the ethics committee for the Mayo and as well as the some all the like Mayo AI devices actually goes through me. I also sometimes struggle myself, you know, how to
Yeah.
ask them what guardrails you put because they don't know even about this the difference, you know.
And I think the critical thing to ask any vendor when you're analyzing the system is to be like, okay, what if this goes wrong, what do I care about? And then just ask the vendor, how do you measure that?
But they
And if
cannot even that's what I'm saying. Like they cannot even answer it in like a simple word
and I think
that
that's the biggest red flag.
exact.
Right? You can't have that system. If they don't know how it works and
Right.
how in the real world, then I wouldn't let it touch a patient. And that's why we had to build this because it doesn't exist. And it
Right.
continues to not exist. And I think that's one maybe the biggest problem in this entire space right now is the technology is running so far ahead of the regulatory science again, and that's why I think the US will end up regulated at some point. But the UK and Europe is definitely in that space already. I think it is the right space to be.
Thank you.
Anyone else for anything else?
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Pimenta. I think if we have no more questions, I guess we can again give our speaker another round of applause
Thanks so much.
for this really good talk and very interesting talk. And if you have, if anybody has any questions, we will put you in touch with the speaker directly, and you can ask him. And with that, we'll end this MedAI session. Thank you so much, Dr. Pimenta, for presenting.
I will go to bed. Bye bye.